The sun was sinking low over the endless New Mexico plains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rust. Dust rolled across the barren land as Eli McGraw, a weathered rancher in his late 30s, guided his last few cattle toward the corral. The day had been long, the work lonely, just as he preferred it. Ever since his wife had died 5 winters ago from fever, Eli had spoken little and felt even less. The silence of his ranch was his only comfort, and he had no room left for strangers, or for memories. As he closed the gate, the air changed. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something human. In the distance, against the blood-orange horizon, Eli saw a dark figure swaying on horseback. The rider moved unsteadily, barely holding on, before finally collapsing from the saddle and falling into the dust. Eli cursed under his breath. Out here, trouble came in many forms. Desperados, runaways, drifters, but it was against his nature to leave someone for the coyotes. He spurred his horse forward, the hooves cutting through the silence, and reached the fallen rider just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The stranger was a woman. Her face was hidden beneath a hood and a tattered poncho soaked with mud and blood. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small satchel close to her chest, as if it contained her very life. Eli knelt beside her, feeling the faint pulse at her neck. She was freezing, barely conscious. "Hey," he said, shaking her gently. "You alive?" Her lips moved, cracked and pale. A single word escaped in a whisper. "Please." That was enough for him. With a grunt, Eli lifted her into his arms, set her on his horse, and rode hard for the ranch as thunder cracked across the sky. The rain came down in sheets, soaking them both by the time he reached the barn. He carried her inside, laid her on a cot near the fire, and stoked the flames until the room glowed warm again. Under the flickering light, Eli finally got a clearer look at her. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with tangled hair and skin ghostly pale from cold. Her clothes were torn, her boots worn thin, and her left wrist bore rope marks, deep and raw. Whoever she was, she hadn't just been lost. She'd been running. He removed her wet poncho and covered her with a wool blanket, trying not to notice the faint scent of smoke and lavender clinging to her. When she stirred, her eyes fluttered open, wide, frightened, and blue as mountain ice. Where am I?" she asked weakly. "My ranch," Eli replied, his voice low but steady. "You passed out on my land." "Rest now." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through. "They'll come," she murmured, before closing her eyes again. Eli frowned but said nothing. He sat by the fire, his mind racing. "They'll come." Who was she talking about? A husband? Bandits? The law? Outside, the storm raged on, battering the roof and walls. Inside, the rancher watched over the stranger, something stirring in him he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of concern, almost tenderness. He told himself it was just decency, that he'd send her on her way once morning came. But deep down, as he saw her breathing steady and the color return to her cheeks, Eli McGraw knew better. The world had just brought trouble to his doorstep, and trouble had a woman's face. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but nothing about his life would ever be quiet again. When the first rays of morning sun filtered through the cracks of the barn, Eli McGraw stirred from the chair where he'd dozed off. The stranger, still wrapped in his wool blanket, lay breathing softly on the cot. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and still. But Eli's mind was far from calm. All night, her broken words echoed in his head. "They'll come." He rose quietly, made coffee, and fed the horses before returning. When she opened her eyes, startled to find him there, he noticed something peculiar. She still wore a scarf over the lower half of her face, even though the room was warm. The fabric was old and frayed, but she held it in place as if her life depended on it. "You're safe here," Eli said, setting down a cup of water. "Name's McGraw. You rode in half dead last night. You got a name?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara. Clara Boone." The name meant nothing to him, but there was a weight in the way she said it, as if she'd buried it long ago and only now dared to speak it again. Eli nodded. "You got family nearby, Clara Boone?" Her hands tightened around the blanket. "No family." Then after a pause, she added, "And no one who'll come looking for me." He didn't press further. Out on the frontier, everyone had ghosts, and some were best left alone. Still, there was something about her, something fragile but unyielding. Despite her exhaustion, she insisted on helping, sweeping the floor and tending to his horses. When Eli tried to stop her, she met his eyes and said softly, "I've got to do something. If I stop moving, I'll remember." That line settled deep in his chest. Over the next few days, Clara began to move about the ranch with quiet purpose. She cooked simple meals, patched his shirts, and hummed songs he hadn't heard in years, melodies from the saloons of El Paso and the dusty theaters along the border towns. Yet she still refused to take off that scarf. Even when the desert sun beat down, even when sweat ran down her neck, she kept it there, always covering her face. Sometimes, Eli caught her staring at her reflection in the wash basin, her hand hovering near the fabric but never pulling it away. When she noticed him watching, she'd turn quickly and change the subject. Then one afternoon, as they were fixing the corral fence, a group of armed riders appeared on the ridge, a sheriff's deputy and 3 men in dusters. They asked if Eli had seen a woman traveling alone, possibly injured, heading west. Eli's jaw tightened. "Haven't seen a soul in weeks," he lied. The deputy studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp and suspicious. Finally, he tipped his hat and rode off, but Eli knew the way those men looked at him wasn't the end of it. When he returned to the house, Clara was trembling by the window. "They were asking about me, weren't they?" He nodded. "You want to tell me why?" She sank onto the chair, gripping her scarf. "Because I ran," she whispered. "And they don't like when something they own decides to run." The way she said "own" chilled him to the bone. Her voice broke then, and for the first time, Eli saw a flash of the terror behind her guarded calm. That night, after she went to bed, he sat by the fire staring at the flames, realizing the truth. This woman wasn't just a stranger in trouble. She was the kind of trouble that changes a man's life. When the wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, Eli made a silent promise to protect her, no matter who came looking. And in that moment, without knowing it, the hardened rancher's lonely heart began to beat again. The night came colder than usual, though the fire in Eli McGraw's cabin burned steady. A tense quiet filled the room, the kind that pressed on the walls and made every creak sound louder than it should. Clara Boone sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring into the flames as if trying to draw courage from them. Eli sat across from her, cleaning his rifle in silence. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. Ever since the riders had come asking, she hadn't been herself. Her movements were sharp, her eyes distant. She barely ate, barely slept. That evening, Eli noticed her trembling fingers as she tried to mend one of his shirts. He'd seen fear before, men in battle, women in towns facing hunger, but Clara's fear was something else. It was shame, heavy and private. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low, almost gentle. "You don't have to tell me, but it'd help to know what we're up against." She didn't answer. Instead, she rose from her chair and stood facing the fire, her back to him. "You think I don't know I brought trouble to your door?" she said, her tone trembling between guilt and defiance. "I should have kept riding, but I couldn't. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Eli set the rifle down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're safe here. I ain't about to hand you over to anyone." That was when she turned. Her blue eyes glimmered in the firelight filled with tears. "You say that now," she whispered. "But you don't know what I am." She reached for her scarf. Her hands shook as they touched the fabric that had never left her face since she'd arrived. For a long moment she froze, as if some invisible force held her back. Then, with a slow, shuddering breath, she pulled it down. Eli's breath caught. A deep, raw brand marred the side of her cheek, burned in the shape of a crooked B. The skin was scarred and twisted, a cruel mark carved there not by fate, but by man. She flinched under his gaze, turning her head away. "I took it off. Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't look at me like that." Eli didn't speak. For a moment, all he could do was stare, frozen between anger and disbelief, not at her, but at the thought of someone doing such a thing. When he finally moved, it wasn't away, but toward her. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and lifted her chin so she had to meet his eyes. "Who did this?" he asked softly. Her lips trembled. "Cyrus Boone," she said. "My husband. He marked me like cattle so no one would ever forget I belonged to him." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I ran the night he tried to kill me. I shot him. I don't even know if he's dead." The truth hung between them, heavy as thunder. Eli's fists clenched at his sides. "He's the one sending men after you." Clara nodded. "He's got money, land, and friends in every county. There's nowhere safe. I just wanted to disappear." Eli stepped back, pacing the floor. He had seen cruelty before. Outlaws who took what they wanted. Soldiers who burned what they couldn't own. But hearing her story lit something fierce inside him. When he looked back at her, his eyes were different, harder, but also warmer. "You're staying here," he said firmly. "Ain't no man alive gonna touch you again. Not while I breathe." Clara's tears came freely then, but for the first time, they weren't just from fear. They were from relief. She had expected disgust, pity, rejection. Instead, she found something she'd long forgotten: protection. That night, she slept by the fire, her face uncovered, her breathing calm. And Eli McGraw sat awake, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere beyond those plains, he knew, Cyrus Boone was coming. But for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel empty. He felt alive, and ready for whatever hell would follow. The days that followed were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Eli McGraw knew it well. He felt it in his bones, in the way the wind shifted, in how the coyotes stopped their howling at night. Trouble was out there, moving closer. Since the night Clara revealed her secret, something had changed between them. She no longer hid her face, and he no longer pretended indifference. The scar didn't frighten him. It fueled something fierce inside him. He began training her to use a rifle, showing her how to aim steady, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. She was a quick learner. The first time she hit a tin can at 50 paces, she turned to him with a faint, trembling smile, the first he'd ever seen. But peace, like water in the desert, never lasted long. It started with tracks near the creek, fresh boot prints that didn't belong to either of them. Then, 2 nights later, a rider passed in the dark, watching the ranch from a distance. Eli caught a glimpse of a wide-brimmed hat and a glint of metal before the rider vanished into the hills. He knew what that meant. Cyrus Boone's men had found them. The next morning, Eli saddled his horse and rode into the nearby trading post for supplies. Word traveled fast in small towns, and he heard whispers even before he reached the counter. Someone asked the clerk if a rancher named McGraw lived out east by the ridge. Another mentioned that a posse of armed men had been seen camped along the San Pedro River, men with Boone cattle brands on their saddles. By the time Eli returned to the ranch, his mind was set. "They're coming," he told Clara flatly. "We don't have much time." Clara's face went pale, but her voice was steady. "Then we stand." She insisted on fighting beside him. "I'm done running, Eli. I won't hide in another man's shadow." "Not again." There was something in her eyes, strength born of suffering, a fire that refused to die. Eli wanted to tell her to stay safe, to hide in the cellar if things went bad, but he knew she wouldn't. She had faced hell before. This time, she wanted to face it standing. Together, they prepared. They gathered every bullet they had, boarded up the windows, and reinforced the barn. Clara filled canteens, loaded rifles, and tied her hair back tight. Eli watched her move with quiet resolve, realizing she wasn't the same frightened woman who'd stumbled onto his land weeks ago. She had found her spirit again, and in doing so, had given him back his own. That evening, they stood on the porch as the sun bled into the horizon. The desert glowed red, like the sky itself knew what was coming. "They'll come at dawn," Eli said, scanning the open land with his rifle slung across his shoulder. Clara stepped beside him, gripping her revolver. "Then dawn it is." They stood there in silence, side by side. No words of comfort, no promises of survival, just an understanding. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. As the light faded, a distant sound rolled through the valley, the faint echo of horses. Dozens of them. The horizon shimmered with dust. Eli's heart tightened. He could already see the lead rider's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black hat that caught the dying light. Cyrus Boone. Even from miles away, Clara knew that figure. Her hands trembled, but only for a second. She drew her revolver and whispered, "It ends tonight." Eli looked at her, this scarred, brave woman who had lost everything and still stood tall, and nodded. "It ends when we say it does." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and blood in the making. The horizon burned crimson as the Boone riders advanced, and the McGraw ranch waited, silent, defiant, ready for war. The first light of dawn spilled across the plains, painting the land in hues of gold and red. But at the McGraw ranch, the morning held no peace, only the grim stillness of people waiting for a fight they might not survive. Eli McGraw stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where a dark line of riders advanced through the dust. Behind him, Clara Boone checked her revolver with steady hands, her expression calm but fierce. "They're here," Eli said quietly. Clara joined him, the rising sun glinting off the metal of her weapon. "Then let's finish it." The Boone riders came hard and fast. A dozen men led by Cyrus Boone himself, tall and broad with a black hat and a cruel smile carved into his weathered face. His voice carried across the wind as he called out, "McGraw! Hand over what's mine and I'll let you live." Eli stepped forward, rifle leveled. "You've got nothing here that belongs to you, Boone." Boone laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "That woman belongs to me. You think a scar makes her free? She's marked for life." "My mark." Clara's voice rang out from behind Eli. "That mark don't mean a damn thing anymore." Her defiance made Boone's grin vanish. He raised his hand and shouted, "Kill them both!" The air erupted with gunfire. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and shattering glass. Eli dropped behind the porch rail, returning fire with sharp, measured precision. He hit one man clean off his horse, then another who tried to flank the barn. Clara, crouched by the window, fired her revolver with the focus of someone who had waited her whole life to fight back. Each shot was an act of defiance, a reclamation of power stolen from her long ago. Smoke filled the air. Horses screamed. The dry grass caught a stray spark, and flames began to crawl across the field. The ranch became a battleground of fire and fury. Eli shouted over the chaos, "Get to the barn! We can hold there!" They ran through the smoke, coughing, the world around them dissolving in orange and black. Inside the barn, they took cover behind hay bales, reloading as the Boone gang closed in. The heat was suffocating. The fire outside roared louder, creeping closer with every second. Through the haze, Cyrus Boone appeared in the doorway, gun drawn, eyes wild. "You should have stayed dead, Clara," he snarled. Clara rose, trembling but unbroken. "And you should have stayed human." Boone fired first, grazing her arm. Eli returned the shot, hitting Boone square in the shoulder, but the man didn't fall. He lunged forward, tackling Eli to the ground. The two men grappled in the dirt, fists flying, blood mixing with smoke. Boone's strength was monstrous. Years of rage and power burned in him like wildfire. Eli, half blinded by blood, reached for the fallen rifle, but before Boone could bring down his blade, a single gunshot rang through the barn. Cyrus Boone froze, his expression twisting in disbelief. He looked down to see Clara standing behind him, revolver smoking, eyes steady. The bullet had gone clean through his heart. Boone stumbled, fell to his knees, and collapsed face first into the dirt. The fight outside faded as the remaining men saw their leader fall and fled into the desert. Silence slowly returned, broken only by the crackling of flames consuming what was left of the ranch. Eli rose shakily, his chest heaving. Clara dropped her gun, staring at Boone's lifeless body. "It's over," she whispered. He stepped to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's over." But as they stepped outside, the sight of the burning ranch brought no joy, only the quiet ache of survival. Everything Eli had built was gone, turned to ash. Yet when he looked at Clara, standing tall in the glow of the rising sun, he realized he'd gained something greater than land. He'd found a reason to fight, to live, to begin again, and as the fire devoured his past, Eli McGraw and Clara Boone walked toward the dawn, together, unbroken and free. When the smoke finally cleared, the McGraw ranch was nothing but blackened earth and memory. The corral lay in ruins, the barn reduced to a skeletal frame, and the once proud house stood as a shell of ash. The wind moved softly across the wreckage, carrying the scent of smoke and gunpowder away. In the middle of it all stood Eli McGraw and Clara Boone, side by side, covered in soot and exhaustion. Their clothes were torn, their hands burned, but they were alive. Around them, the land seemed dead, but above it, the sky was a soft, pale blue, hinting that the world, somehow, would go on. Eli broke the silence first. "Looks like the land's starting fresh," he said quietly, staring at the smoldering ruins. "Maybe that's what we're meant to do, too." Clara didn't answer. She knelt beside a pile of burnt timber, the remains of the small table where she'd once mended his shirts, where they'd shared coffee in silence. Her hands brushed over the charred wood, black dust smearing her fingers. "This place saved me," she whispered, "and now it's gone." Eli stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It did more than save you, Clara. It gave you a chance to start again. Gave us both one." She looked up at him then, eyes glistening not from sorrow, but from something gentler, peace, maybe, or disbelief, that she'd survived everything meant to break her. "Do you really think we can start over?" Eli gave a small, tired smile. "We already have. They buried what needed burying. Cyrus Boone's body was dragged far beyond the ridge, left to the desert he had used to break others." Eli said no prayer, only a promise that the man would haunt no one again. The Boone man never returned. Without their leader, their cruelty scattered like dust in the wind. Days passed as they rebuilt from nothing. Eli salvaged what he could, nails, tools, a few surviving fence posts. Clara helped him patch together a shelter, small but strong. They worked side by side in silence, their movements speaking the words neither dared say aloud. Every strike of the hammer, every plank of wood laid down was a declaration. We are still here. At night, when the desert turned cold, they sat by the new fire outside, wrapped in one blanket. Clara would sometimes hum the songs she once sang in saloons, the soft, lonely kind that drifted through the night like ghosts. But now her voice didn't sound haunted. It sounded alive. One evening, Eli found her standing by the fence line, staring toward the horizon. The setting sun bathed her scar in golden light, turning what once seemed a mark of shame into something almost sacred. "You ain't hiding it no more," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. "It's part of me. I used to think it was a curse, but it's proof I survived." Eli nodded, his eyes soft. "Proof you're stronger than any man who ever tried to break you." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. When the wind brushed past, carrying the scent of sage and new grass, it felt like a blessing. Weeks turned to months. The land healed, slow but sure. Wildflowers began to bloom where the fire had raged, and Eli's cattle, what few had survived, returned to graze. The new house rose from the ashes, smaller than the old one, but warmer. Inside, there was laughter sometimes, and a peace neither of them had known before. One morning, as dawn spilled across the plains, Clara stood on the porch in a clean dress, her hair loose, the sunlight catching the faint scar on her face. Eli came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She whispered, You didn't turn away. He kissed her hair. Never will. They stood there watching the sun climb over the endless horizon. The ranch was gone, but a home had been born in its place. A home built not from wood or stone, but from survival, trust, and the courage to love again. And as the desert wind carried the first warmth of a new day, Eli McGraw and Clara Boone began their life anew, two souls remade by fire, standing together beneath the vast, forgiving sky of the Wild West.